The title of the message is A Father's Prerogative to Prove His Children. To prove them. Malachi chapter 1 in verse 6. Malachi 1 verse 6. This, of course, is God talking. He says, a son honoreth his father. That's taken for granted. Not many of them do nowadays. But at the time of the writing, that was taken for granted. A son was going to honor his father. And a servant his master. Now God makes an application. If then I be a father, where is mine honor? He said, somebody's not honoring me that should be. He's not talking to the lost world here, as we would think of it. He's talking to his people. And he's saying, you know better. You should be honoring me, and you're not. We'll finish the verse. He says, and if I be a master, where's my fear? Saith the Lord of hosts unto you. O priests. That's who he's talking to. He's talking to the religious crowd. The priests. He said, y'all are not treating me like you're supposed to. O priests that despise my name. And you say, wherein have we despised thy name? They say, we haven't done anything against God. He says, I'm looking at it from my point of view, you have, and I'm the only point of view that matters. And that's a fact. If you're a Christian, God is your father. Before you got saved, the devil was your father. But if you're saved, God's your father.
Amen.
And we had better give him respect and honor that he deserves. Now, just a few verses to prove that he is actually your father. In James, he says this, of his own will, this is talking about God, of his own will begat he us. You know what begat means? Birthed. In Genesis, you find in chapter 5, it says, and this one begot that one and begot that one. It doesn't mean they went shopping for it. It meant they had a child. Of his own will begat he us with the word of truth. Who's the word of truth?
Jesus.
There is a person named the word of truth. In John, he says this, and the word, capital W, that's the name of a person, proper noun. The word was made flesh. That's how God became man. He took on flesh. And the word was made flesh and dwelt among us. So, how were you made into a son of God? One of the sons of God was by the birthing of Jesus Christ. He birthed you. If you're truly saved. If not, then your father's the devil. Now let's go to one place in the Bible, and we'll find out how men that were supposed to be good men, just like we saw in Malachi, it was the priest he was yelling at. Here Jesus Christ is going to yell at the disciples because they're not doing things the way they're supposed to. And we'll take a lesson from it so he doesn't do the same to us, hopefully. I'll give you the context of where we're going. In Luke, Jesus early on in his ministry, well, this is not early on, this is about midpoint of his ministry. He sends out his disciples, lets them go be evangelists, pairs them up, 2 by 2, they go out. This is not the 70, this is the 12. Sends them out, and they go out and they evangelize. That had to have been exciting. Think about it. They've been with Jesus learning directly from God himself. It doesn't get any better than that. And now he's told them, you go out and give this message. You be my representative. That had to be exciting. And I'm sure that they went out there and they got on fire. They were amazed by what God allowed them to do, I'm sure. And I'll just read it to you. In Luke 9, he says this. Then he called his 12 disciples together and gave them power and authority. They didn't just send them out. He said, I'm deputizing you. And he says, and he sent them to preach. Okay, they weren't just out there joining social clubs. They were preaching. They had a message. Okay, they were preachers, itinerant preachers. Then, in the meantime, something tragic happened. John the Baptist died. He didn't just die of old age. Herod chopped his head off. And it was because he hated God. He hated that John the Baptist wasn't afraid to preach against his sin. And when that happened, his head had to roll. So they cut off John the Baptist's head. Then the disciples came back from their mission trip they've been on to Jesus. It says, and he took them and went aside privately into a desert place that belonged to the city called Bethsaida. So they have them now a welcome home committee. They get together, a little private meeting between Jesus and the disciples after they've come back from evangelizing the world. That had to be exciting. Then, shortly after that, Jesus goes out and does ministry like they've been doing it previous to this. Now, this had to be a wake-up call to the disciples. Think about it. They've been out as missionaries preaching. They've been given authority by Jesus Christ. Here's what always happens. You give somebody a little bit of authority, and you know what they do? They suddenly think they have all authority. So there's going to have to be a wake-up call. Always is. They've been given a little bit of authority to go preach and teach and share the message. Now they've come back, and he's going to have to bring them down a peg or two so they remember they're disciples. They're still apostles. They still learn from the master. Just because they've had a job to do doesn't mean that they're the end-all be-all. Jesus does his public ministry. In Luke chapter 9, verse 11, it says, and the people, when they knew of it, followed him, and he received them, and he spake unto them of the kingdom of God, and healed them that needed healing. This is a big, like a Billy Graham crusade going on here. And as we'll get into this is at least 5,000 men there. Okay, these children, these disciples, have them a great idea. And they kind of feel like they deserve to have a good idea because they've been out on their own. They've been doing ministry. They know what they're doing. So they see that Jesus is missing something here. So they're going to inform him of what he needs to do. Matthew chapter 14, look at verse 15. Matthew 14, verse 15. Matthew 14, verse 15. And when it was even, his disciples came to him, saying, this is a desert place, and the time is now past. Send the multitude away, that they may go into the villages and buy themselves victuals. That's Matthew 14, verse 15. So the disciples show up, say, hey, look, it's getting late now. We've been holding this meeting all day long, probably for several days. But, hey, it's late. People get hungry at night. Tell the people to go home. Maybe they'll just disperse into some of these villages and come back tomorrow morning. That's fine. But let them go buy them something to eat. Now, that's the disciples, a group. We're not given names of who said that, but we know it's the consensus of the group. Okay, I'm going to show it to you in another passage. Same story, Mark chapter 6. Mark 6, verse 35. I'm going to give you all of these accounts because each one has a little different detail. And you add all of these details together and you get the full story of what happened. Mark 6, verse 35. And when the day was now far spent, his disciples came unto him and said, this is a desert place, and now the time is far past. Send them away that they may go into the country round about and into the villages and buy themselves bread, for they have nothing to eat. Okay, so they're going to buy themselves bread. In Matthew, they're going to buy themselves bread. You get the point? I'm not spending any money on them. Let them go pay for their own food. They're adults. And that was the consensus. Send them home. Luke 9, same story. Luke 9, verse 12. Luke 9, verse 12. Luke is very gracious here. He leaves out the harsh details. And when the day began to wear away, did I tell you where I am? Luke 9, 12. The day began to wear away. Then came the 12 and said unto him, send the multitude away, that they may go into the towns and the country round about and lodge and get victuals. He didn't say they had to buy it, just get it. Maybe they're stealing it, I don't know. For we are here in a desert place. Okay, so they've said, look, there's a problem. You've not identified this problem, and we identified it for you. Furthermore, we solved the problem for you. You didn't even know there was a problem, and we solved it. These people need to go, and they need to find some pennies in their own pockets, and they need to pay for them something to eat. Because I didn't call them in here saying everybody's promised a meal. So they need to go get their own food. Do what? And a place to sleep. Okay, well, the next point we'll see is their idea. Their great idea they brought to the teacher. Jesus expands. And now the students become disenchanted. Once Jesus adds to their plan, he often does that with us. We say, here's a great plan. And he says, oh, you think that's a great plan? Here's what you need. And he starts putting other things on it. And we say, that's impossible. Wait a minute. I can't do all of that. I just had this little plan that I thought was doable. And he says, no, that's not enough. Not God size yet. Let's add more to it. Until you realize you can't complete what he wants done, it's not of him. Look at it in Matthew 14. Matthew 14, verse 16. This is the way Jesus talks. Matthew 14, verse 16. But Jesus said unto them, they need not depart. So right off the bat he said, no, you're wrong. All of them had said they need to leave. He says, no, they do not. If they had needed to leave, I would have dismissed them. So don't tell me what to do. He says, they need not depart. Give ye them to eat. They start, well, I barely got enough for me. How am I going to feed these people too? I mean, think about it. Nobody was prepared to share. The Care Bear book that Laura loved was The Day Nobody Shared. This is the day nobody was willing to share. Well, we'll see. Eventually somebody will. Okay, that was our passage in Matthew. See the same story in Mark. Mark 6, verse 37. Mark 6, verse 37. I'm comparing all of these stories because when you get to John's account, it appears that John's account is different than the rest of them. But it's not. And I'm going to show you how it all fits. Mark 6, verse 37. He answered and said unto them, give ye them to eat. We've seen that so far. And they said unto him, shall we go and buy 200 pennyworth of bread and give them to eat? So now they've put a dollar amount on it. It's going to take, in my estimation, 200 pennyworth. Well, if a penny is a day's wage, we're talking about almost a whole year's worth of pay to just buy bread for one meal. Now, we look at 200 pennyworth and it doesn't calculate, but you'll find another passage where a man's looking for day laborers. And he says, I'll pay you a penny a day. And that was a day's wage. So 200 pennies worth meant almost the entire year's worth of paycheck. So that would have been a lot of money. And somebody says, hey, the disciples get together and say, hey, look, 200 penny worth. You know, if we could spend all that we could make in a year, it still isn't going to, do much. So Jesus' plan isn't really that great a plan for us. That's what they're thinking. Now, they're not coming out and saying it that bold, but they're hinting at it. In John, look at John. John chapter 6. John 6, verse 5. When Jesus then lifted up his eyes and saw a great company come unto him, he saith unto Philip. Now, we've seen what the group of disciples have had to say. Now Jesus singles out an individual. Saith unto Philip, look at this question. Whence shall we buy bread that these may eat? And this he said to prove him, for he himself knew what he would do. Get ready. In life, Jesus is going to do the same thing to us. He's going to present a problem, and it's going to look like there's no answers to it, because he knows what he's going to do, and he wants to see where your dependency is. Is your dependency on 200 pennyworth? Then good luck finding it. He's not a banker. But if your dependency is on him, he's a miracle worker, and he can do that. And he will. Let's notice the next thing is this private tutelage. He's going to pull Philip aside and give him a little lesson. John 6, look at verse 5. Jesus saith unto Philip. There's 12 of them standing there, but he's just got one he's talking to right now. Now that's a good deal. Jesus has decided one person in the crowd is worthy of learning a lesson. Maybe he thought Philip was receptive to it and the others were not. They were worried about money, and Philip wasn't buying into that whole thing so far. So he pulls Philip in. Says, look, let's discuss some things. I'm going to teach you some things. And that is a father's prerogative. Different times, a father will tell different kids, do different things. And he'll say, hey, you need to learn this. You need more of this education right here. You keep getting this wrong. Let's work on this. Well, okay, that's what Jesus is doing here, and that's his prerogative. He knows what he's doing. He'll do the same with us. Now, he says this. Here's his question. Whence shall we buy bread that these may eat? You know what I would have said? We didn't promise them no bread. Or I would have said, they're all adults. Do I look like my brother's keeper? Bad moves. Yeah. And then I would have said this. You asked a question. You said, whence shall we buy bread that these may eat? That's not really my problem. But you're asking me, where are we going to go buy it? I'm asking you, how are we going to come up with money to buy it? And Jesus' question was not, do we have enough money? His question was simply, which bakery are we going to? That's quite a predicament he's in right there. Well, verse 6, John 6:6. And this he said to prove him. So Philip is in the hot seat. Jesus has proven something to him. For he, Jesus himself, knew what he would do. Jesus has always done things that are beyond man's imagination. He's always capable of it, and he loves to do it. In Exodus 16:4, this is God talking with Moses. Then said the Lord unto Moses, behold, I will rain bread from heaven for you, and the people shall go out and gather a certain rate every day, that I may prove them, whether they will walk in my way or no. Okay, God tells Moses, hey, I'm going to dump down bread on these people, and I'm going to feed them right here in the wilderness. It's a system nobody has ever seen before. I'm going to do it. Moses got to be scratching his head saying, what are you talking? I've never seen it rain bread. He says it's going to. Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 2, it says this. And thou shalt remember all the ways which the Lord thy God led thee these 40 years in the wilderness, to humble thee and to prove thee. Sometimes God's humbling is designed to prove his child. Now, usually the proving is not to prove how great you are, but to prove how sufficient he is. In verse 16, Deuteronomy 8:16, it says this, who fed thee in the wilderness with manna, which thy fathers knew not, that he might humble thee. Usually, when God's humbling a man, if you're in a situation that is humbling, that's probably God. Listen up real close during those times. He says to humble thee, that he might prove thee, to do thee good at thy latter end. If you're in a situation that's humbling you, count on it. That's probably God. And he's doing it to prove you. Don't step outside the boundaries. And he says the benefit is you'll be done good in your latter end. It's for your good. In Psalms chapter 81, Psalms chapter 81, verse 7, he says this: Thou calledest in trouble, and I delivered thee. I answered thee in the secret place of thunder. I proved thee in the waters of Meribah. That's the God I serve. When he humbles you, he's right there with you. He might humble you. He might put you through some situations. He might, just like these disciples, say, you go feed them, and I know you don't have enough money or know-how, but you go do it. Well, that means he's going to be providing. He's going to be guiding. That's a good thing. To Philip's credit, he didn't have any of those bad replies that I would have had. He was smarter than me. But he still didn't have the right answer. That's a failure. After having served as these itinerant preachers, it seems all 12 of these disciples still have some lessons to learn. Let's notice the next one. John 6, verse 7. Here's Philip's failure. Philip answered him. He jumps in the bandwagon with all the rest of the people. He keeps hearing this phrase, 200 pennyworth. It's been rattling around in his ears, so he says, I'll try this one out. Just because you hear somebody say a phrase, a catchphrase, let God give you a catchphrase. Don't repeat what other people say. You may not know what it means. Philip answered him, 200 pennyworth of bread is not sufficient for them, that every one of them may take a little. Philip says, I've got a problem with their solution to the problem. The other people's problem was, even if they had 200 pennyworth, that's not enough for everybody to have a meal. These people have been here all day. If you go all day without eating, when you finally get to eat, you want to get to it. You don't want to sample something. You want to fill that belly. And that's what he's saying right here. 200 pennyworth isn't going to cover the bill. That's a failure. In God's book, that's a failure. In Numbers, the Bible says this, Numbers 11. And Moses said, the people among whom I am are 600,000 footmen. That's a whole bunch of people. Moses is probably dealing with 1 million to 2 million congregation. And Moses is complaining to God. And thou hast said, I will give them flesh to eat that they may eat a whole month. Moses said, look, you see all this people out here? That's 2 million people. Get your calculator out. Because you just said you would feed them for a whole month. Do you know what that bill looks like? That's Moses' mindset. In verse 22 he says this, shall the flocks and the herds be slain for them to suffice them? Moses said, what are we going to do? Kill all our cattle? Is that what you want to do? It's always, man sees things from his own detriment. Okay, God's going to cost me something. That's what Moses was thinking. Okay, if he wants to feed these people, he's taking it out of my pocket. That's not what God's plan was. Verse 23 says this, and the Lord said unto Moses, is the Lord's hand waxen short? Uh-oh. Thou shalt see now whether my word shall come to pass or unto thee or not. God's getting a little short with him by saying, I don't have a short hand, but my temper's getting short. He says, you're going to see whether or not I mean what I say. And he did. He brought in quail. Now, in our story, back there with the feeding of the 5,000, Jesus has been talking to one person, Philip. And Philip has failed the test. But soon after, somebody else volunteers to fail. Andrew interrupts and then self-destructs. John chapter 6, verse 8. John 6, verse 8. And one of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother. You know, this is odd. Simon Peter kept his mouth shut this time. But he didn't have, maybe he was whispering in Andrew's ear. Hey, tell him this. Usually it's Peter that speaks up. But this time it's Peter's brother. Andrew said unto him, there is a lad here which hath 5 barley loaves, and 2 small fishes. But I need to fail this test too. But what are they among so many? They've always come right as close as they can get to being in faith and then pull their toe back. I just can't step out on nothing. In this Christian life, it requires faith.
That's right.
Faith is not having the floor under your feet. Faith is trusting God to put it there when you step. That's tough. Look up at verse 6. The whole thing started with this phrase. And this he said to prove him. That's faith. God's going to prove you. He's going to ask you to do things without you seeing any answers in sight. Simply knowing him as the answer. Now, if you've got him, you don't need anything else. Because he comes with the full supply of everything.
Amen.
The disciples' success or failure in answering these questions and being proved by Jesus did not diminish his power to perform. The 5,000 are still going to get fed, whether the disciples give the right answer or not. And they did. Look at the instruction that Jesus gives. John 6, verse 10. This is interesting. Oftentimes, this is what God does with us. He gives us instruction without explanation. Do this. But why? None of your business. Do this. That's the way God does us. One step at a time. He knows the end result. That's why he's saying, okay, now step left, now step right. Because he knows where we're going. He doesn't have to tell us. In John 6, verse 10, Jesus said, make them sit down. Now there was much grass in the place, so the men sat down in number about 5,000. That's a whole bunch of people, just counting the men. Not talking about the women or children. There was just 5,000 men. I guess that's who does the most eating. That was the number they were counting. So he says, go tell them all to sit down. Well, you know what it means when Mama says, everybody come to the table. You know what that means? Dinner's about to be served. Jesus says, y'all go ahead and sit down. Get your forks, get your napkins, and sit down. Okay, there's about to be a spread put on. In Luke, it says it this way. For there were about 5,000 men, and he said unto the disciples, make them sit down by 50s in company. So now he said, don't just tell them to sit down anywhere. I want you to group them by groups. So the disciples did have some work to do. This is, at minimum, we'll say 10,000 people here. If there's just 5,000 men, at least 10,000. So the disciples have to go through and count. They got to do a little math. Better learn math. They've got to go through and separate them. 50. Okay, you 50, sit right here. Y'all 50, sit right here. You're social distanced. Not by 10, by 50s. That's biblical. So 50s, they had to do a little work. Now, he didn't tell them why to do that. He didn't say, well, it's going to be easier for you to pass the bread if you have them in a group of 50. They may have been scratching their heads wondering, what difference does it make if they're in groups of 50? We're wasting all this time separating people by 50. We could just get this show on the road. But he had a reason for it. None of their business. You just do what I say. It'll work out. In John chapter 6, verse 12. John 6, verse 12. He had already performed the miracle. They got the fish and the bread, and everybody got a full tummy. Then Jesus says this. When they were finished, he said unto his disciples, gather ye up the fragments that remain, that nothing be lost. They've already fed them. They performed a miracle. People got their tummies filled. Now the disciples are sitting here thinking, you've been working me all day, and now you're telling me to go clean up. Why? I gave them a meal. Now I've got to go be their waiter? I got to clean up after them? They're all adults. Tell them to clean up after themselves. They had some work to do. He said, go clean up. I probably would have said this one. Look, think about it. We gave them fish, and we gave them bread. All of that's biodegradable. I'm not even worried about cleaning up. The ants will get it. It'll turn back into dust. But no, he said clean up. So guess what? We should be clean. I got behind somebody from Louisiana the other day, and for some reason it was just not setting well with me. I'll put it that way. I kept seeing them throw trash out the window. That's the opposite of the way a Christian should live. We should be neat and clean. Here, Jesus told them to clean up, even though nature would have cleaned it up for him had he left it there. It was just bread and fish. It would have been biodegradable. But he said, no, we're going to leave a neat, clean place. Christians, the more you get in the Bible and the more following of Christ you do, the more you'll realize you're supposed to be a neat, clean person. That's just a simple rule that he gives them. Okay, in Proverbs chapter 18, verse 9, the Bible says this: He also that is slothful in his work is brother to him that is a great waster. You know, we waste stuff, especially in America. We're so wasteful. Jesus didn't waste anything. You notice that they had more than they needed, but he had a plan for that too. He said, we're not wasting it, and we're going to clean up after ourselves. That's a message that America needs to be preached hard, I guess, is no wasting.
Right.
We're such wasters. Now, part of the problem is people over-provide for us. You go to a restaurant, they're going to give you more food than you can eat in a week. And you shouldn't eat all that mess. That's right. You're going to be big as a house. In Isaiah, the Bible says this: Behold, I have created the smith that bloweth the coals in the fire, and that bringeth forth an instrument for his work. I have created the waster to destroy. Who's the waster in the passage? The devil. You know what being a waster is? It's satanic. Ooh. That's the name given to the devil. Wow. We better be careful. Better get off that point quick. Now, after the children or the disciples have done what they're supposed to do, they'll finally get understanding. But the understanding most of the time in the Christian life comes after obedience, not before. Your understanding of why God tells you to do this or do that is not that important. Simple obedience is important. After the obedience, usually, we say, oh, that made perfect sense. Sometimes he'll give us understanding. Sometimes he doesn't even do it then. But it's our obedience is required. John 6, verse 13. John 6, verse 13. Therefore they gathered them together and filled 12 baskets with the fragments of the 5 barley loaves, which remained over and above unto them that had eaten. So, after everybody's done eating, there's 12 baskets left over. This is great. I'm going to show you a little known miracle right here in this passage. Where did they get 12 baskets? I mean, think about it. These people have traveled up into the mountains and they didn't even bring food. Where did 12 baskets come from? Well, if he can provide a miracle to give you more than you need, he'll provide you a place to put what you don't have or what you don't need. Right then. Now, it could be that these were leftovers to pay his workers, the disciples. How many of them were? There's 12 of them, right? Okay, and there's 12 baskets. Each of them get a basket of goodies. Could be. I don't know. Look at John 6. Look at verse 14. Then those men, when they had seen the miracles that Jesus did, said, of a truth, that this is of a truth that prophet that should come into the world. Now there's what he was shooting for the whole time. He wanted to announce himself as God in the flesh. When God performs a miracle in our life, we don't need to say, I knew it all along, or I figured it. We need to say, that's God. That's supernatural. That's what he was wanting right there. Our next point is simply, the profound point of proving is simply that Jesus Christ is the prophet. And when I say prophet, I mean supernatural God, foretelling the future, prophet. But I also mean for your profit, your benefit. Luke chapter 7. Luke 7 verse 16. He's always doing this, wanting the same result. Luke 7:16. This is the widow of Nain's son. And there came fear on all. This is after he's raised her son to life. And they glorified God, saying, a great prophet is risen up among us, and that God hath visited his people. That's why he does miraculous things. That's why he asks us to step out in faith and let him do something. Because he wants to show himself. If he doesn't do something miraculous that no human could do, then we walk around all day long getting credit for everything. That's right. In Matthew 14:24 it says this. This happens, matter of fact, right after the feeding of the 5,000. But the ship was now in the midst of the sea, tossed with the waves, for the wind was contrary. Why is the wind contrary? Because he's going to prove them. When things get rough, that's God stepping in saying, I'm going to prove it. I'm going to prove you. If you're his son, that's his right to do. In Matthew 14, look at verse 32. And when they were coming to the ship, and the wind ceased, then they that were in the ship came and worshipped him, saying, of a truth, thou art the Son of God. That's why things get tough. Because you wouldn't notice him if things were smooth. They wouldn't have been looking for him. They wouldn't have been noticing had everything just been smooth sailing. They would have made it to the other side. Nobody would have cared about the journey that it took to get there. He gets that water rough, and suddenly every little thing that's out of place gets noticed. Okay, God's going to show up. In Mark 6, verse 51, it says this. And he went up unto them into the ship, and the wind ceased, and they were sore amazed in themselves beyond measure and wonder, because he's proven them. Verse 52, for they considered not the miracle of the loaves. For their heart was hardened. You know what that means? That's such a convicting verse. It means right there, if you've ever seen God's hand, have you ever seen God do anything specially for you? Where you could say, I identified God did that specially for me. I knew the supernatural interfered, and God helped me. If you can see that, you saw what the 5,000 saw with that miracle. And Jesus said, when you get into a boat in the water, you should remember miracle of loaves and say, I can do with water the same thing I did with bread. Now, we wouldn't have put those two together. I'd have said, yeah, he can break bread, but this ain't bread. We're about to die. There's a difference here. Jesus said there was no difference. The one who provided the bread can calm the water. We don't need answers. We need the one who is the answer. Amen. In John chapter 6, verse 19. John 6, verse 19. So when they had rowed about 5 and 20 or 30 furlongs, they see Jesus walking on the sea and drawing nigh unto the ship, and they were afraid. When you get afraid, guess what? Look around. Jesus is there. And you know what he's going to say? This next thing that he always says. Verse 20. But he said unto them, it is I. Be not afraid. When life gets tough, God's proving you. But you're not going to find it if you're looking at the wrong things. And you'll get scared. He says, be not afraid. Hey, look over here. It's me. That's what he's saying. So in our problems, in our situations where God wants to prove us, be ready and look for him.